Welcome back, and welcome to a very special bonus installment of Out of the Ground, reading the work of Philip Pullman. This one's called Peril of the Pole. Do you have the nerve, the skill, and the daring do to challenge the wind and play Peril of the Pole? This is a race with a difference. Each balloon must get as close to the pole as possible without being sucked to a terrible and certain death in the polar maelstrom. And the winner is the last balloon in the air. Can you pilot your balloon to safety and avoid the icy tempest? The rules are as follows. Well, in description. Once every decade, the great rally to the pole is flown in the far frozen north. Intrepid balloonists and their demons from across the Arctic, both professional traders and daring amateurs, gather together at the city of Reykjavik in Fireland to contest this perilous competition of amazing skill and death-defying hazard. By tradition, the race starts in the perfect ballooning weather conditions of early autumn, when the ocean is still frozen. But this is the calm before the storm, and the first catastrophic tempests of winter can arrive without warning and cause disaster. So dangerous is the race that there have been repeated calls for it to be banned, for as everyone knows, at the North Pole there is a vast system of caverns leading into the center of the earth, where the polar ocean swirls downward in a great vortex of water and fire. I said fire, but I meant ice. It is so horribly dangerous that no one has ever gone there and come back alive. Now you and your demon can experience all the thrills of the rally to the pole together. Normal game courtesies apply, and players may only confer with their demons. You will need one die and a pencil. Too exciting for children under 5 years of age. This, of course, is the game board, which is folded up and enclosed in a little flap at the back of Pullman's Once Upon a Time in the North, the second companion volume to his Dark Materials, which appear, it's short installments, between the completion of that major trilogy and his subsequent Book of Dust. So here we are again to discuss it, and this time I really wanted to start first with the bonus materials at the back because I find them fascinating, and also because this entire project of commentaries and analysis began with the idea that one day, perhaps sooner or later, I would help in bringing Pullman's work to a video game adaptation. I don't know if that's really possible or ever was going to be, but it's fun to imagine, and it's also appropriate in a way that while Pullman is on the record saying some very negative things about video games, he did in fact make a board game along with, well, here it is, a thrilling board game created by Philip Pullman and illustrated by John Lawrence, the illustrator for the first couple of these books, Liar's Oxford and Once Upon a Time in the North. And it's very beautiful, and of course on very high quality paper. Again, this is a production of Smith and Strange Limited, Globetrotter House, Beaumont Street, Oxford, which is a alter ego for David Fickling, his publisher. And so here it is. I'll show those on YouTube, but you can find images of this, and I'll include a link to one if you're just listening or you want to look at it more closely. So yeah, the rules of play. 1. This game is for 4 to 6 players and their demons. Each player should select a different colored balloon piece. And I've got those here. You can probably see this somewhere else, but I'm not sure. There's a little cardstock, and you punch out a few things. This wind compass, not to be confused with the golden compass. And then these 6 balloon pieces of different colors, red and yellow, pale yellow, pale blue, gray, and dark blue. And if you look closely, you'll see that each of the balloons is actually got a little bit of a different design to it. So some are cross-hatched a little bit more, others a little bit less heavily. The yellow one has got a star on it, so that's of course the one that my kids would want to play with. And I've never actually played this game, but I think I'm going to try. My kids aren't much for board games just yet, but one day we'll figure it out. We can play up to 6 players, but not fewer than 4, I guess is the stipulation here. You decide who goes first with a roll of the die. Whoever scores the lowest launches their balloon first before the rest of the field. This player's roll is doubled because of clear skies. Players then take their turns in clockwise order from the first player and roll the die to decide how far they go. Any hazards you encounter must be obeyed. I'll read some of those in a minute. They're delightful. If a player lands on a windrose, and there's a little icon for it, they must face the ever-changing Arctic gusts that make this race so dangerous. Spin the wind using the wind compass to decide in which direction you and your balloon will be blown. And then there's a little asterisk here. It's important that you take a great deal of care when constructing your wind compass. Any inaccuracies could see you and your balloon blown hundreds of miles off course and disqualified from the competition. Follow the instructions and have a brave race. If your compass is not functioning with enough precision, use a die to determine wind direction. Rolling 1, 2, or 3 will send you north, toward the pole. Rolling 4 will send you south, 5 will send you east, and 6 will send you west. So the idea, I guess, is that you place so the card says something about this. You place, for the wind compass, press out the compass shape, push a pencil into the pre-drilled hole. The compass will be most accurate if the pencil is pushed in point down until it sticks out approximately a centimeter. So this is really fiddly. It's got a little tiny hole punched in the middle. And that's what the pencil is for. Not exactly writing, but something like it. And Pullman's talismanic pencils, I think, would be sharpened just right for this to work. Now, move 1 space in the direction shown by the spinner. So this becomes important because you can skip large swaths of the board. The next rule, race officials do not allow 2 balloons to occupy the same airspace. If you land on a space that is occupied by another player's balloon, that player must move on the same number of spaces that you have just thrown. Any hazards encountered because of this must be obeyed. For example, player A throws a 4 and lands on the same space as player B. Player B must move forward 4 spaces. When the last 6 spaces before the pole are within the vortex zone, this is an area of eerie calm, yet extreme danger. When a player lands on one of the red vortex spaces, they are safe and do not need to move again until they throw the exact number of spaces required to reach the pole. For example, if a player is 3 spaces from the pole and rolls a 6, they can rest on their current space and wait for the next throw. Should you be unfortunate enough to reach the pole, your balloon and everything in it will be crushed by the swirling ice and deadly ocean currents that wait there. The last balloon in the air wins the race. So it's a race, but one which you don't want to be the fastest runner in. And I think that's a wonderful little twist. The start is in Reykjavik. It says, "Peril of the pole, can you escape the pool of the deadly north?" And the board is constructed as a kind of rope. Around this time, Pullman says his son was the one who wanted him to write a story about how Lee Scoresby and Yorick Byrnison first met. And in other interviews elsewhere, he talks about getting a book from his son about different rope tying. And I don't know if that would have been this early on or if it happened a little bit after. So one or the other inspired the gift or the book. I'm not sure. The start, of course, Reykjavik, but it's in Fireland, not Iceland. On the 4th spot, there is the first of these hazards that appear. A strong west wind blows, and then blows you onward 3 spaces, which is a bit confusing because it's pointing in the other direction there. Then we go onward. The next is a customs and excise at Novy Odense, near Arkhangelsk in Russia. Customs and excise investigate your balloon, rest while officials carry out their search, and miss your next turn. So it's good to be stopped and slowed down. It's bad to be blown forward. This is where we cross the Norwegian Nunatak. The lake is not marked here, but it does figure in the story. Near us is the Barents Sea, the River Pechora, the River Ob, and the Urals, and then we cross over the Yenisei, which is featured in his Dark Materials. Very importantly, this is where John Perry, also called Joe Paris, or Stanislaus Grumman, has his a tribe that adopts him as their shaman. And there's this town here called Norilsk. We come to the next obstacle. High winds over the Plutorana Plateau push you on 3 spaces. Past the Verkhovensky Highlands, which are marked on here twice, at 12 and 40, oddly. Past the River Lena to Yakutsk. I could have sworn Yakutsk is mentioned, but I can't find it again in the story. So on we go. You are, and this is tricky. Now we have to kind of rotate it or read upside down. You are mistaken for a spy by the Muscovite police. Roll again and move on to make your escape. We are passing maybe it's an albatross, I'm not sure, a big seabird here. There's whales spouting in the ocean below Siberia here. One of these rivers must be the one that Will and Yorick traveled down in the Amber Spyglass, but I couldn't find that river actually mentioned by name, nor is there anywhere actually called a Sungchen Pass, which they talk about, marked on here or in real life that I could discover. But there's a river called the Lena, a river called the Indigirka, the Anadir, the Pezhina, Olaman, and Kolima. These names are so delightful. We cross the Bering Strait, and here's a hazard. Accidentally trespassing on sacred hunting grounds. You must move on 4 more spaces to appease the local shaman. This is right outside Anchorage, Alaska, probably somewhere near that coordinate of the window that John Perry first passed through when he was investigating and writing his airmail paper letters. There are deer, there are winds here, the Great Bear Lake and the Great Slave Lake copper mine. And confused by the tundra, you make a navigation error, roll again and move on over Repulse Bay. And on Baffin Island, we are attacked by cliff ghasts. Your balloon has to roll again and move on to evade the assault. Passing Nuuk and Groenland, Greenland, and the southern Nunats of Greenland. There's a bear on some ice in the German Ocean and the Barents Sea. And here we come to our first, if I'm not missing any, our first opportunity to spin the Windrose. So if you land on the Windrose, you've got a risky proposition here, because if your pencil spinner is working right, you have an equal chance of going north, south, east, or west. And if you go south, then you are spared approximately 30 or a third of the spots of this game which you've just traversed. So the first Windrose appears at spot 33, a third of the way through the game. That's kind of interesting. And the excitement is not lessened by the fact that you could also spin it and get it pointed north. And again, if your spinner isn't working right and you have to roll dice, there's a 50% chance that you are sent north towards the pole. So you're really strongly encouraged to have a decent amount of craftsmanship with your sharpening of your pencil and your spinning of the Windrose, aren't you? If you avoid that entirely and land on the next spot, 34, a magnetic storm, lightning bolt symbol, misleads your instruments at your next turn, double your score. And then there's another Windrose on the very next one. And another Windrose just north of that one. So you could be totally in trouble if you happen to land on spot 35 there. And spot 61, or rather 59 as a result. Here we are at 37, a passing flight of friendly witches over the Yenisei again. Calm the winds to slow your advance. Hover here and miss your next turn. Delightful. Another Windrose by 39. The Verkhovensky Highlands again for some reason are marked with a red flag. Another Windrose at 43, and just past that, your papers are not up to date, and the authorities refuse permission to land. Throw again and move on. That's just above the Chulkolsky Peaks in furthest east Siberia. Another windrose follows. 46, 47, another windrose. The gas valve stuck in position by freezing ice, unable to reduce your speed, you drift on. Move forward another 6 spaces. Bummer. And that would carry you to, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 54, just before which is another windrose and Pond Inlet marked on Baffin Bay. Then you spot bears on the ice and descend to their camp. We're above Greenland again now. In return for the stories you tell them, you are given a bed for the night. Rest and miss your next turn. The power of stories. The power of bears. Then we cross Svalbard for the first time. There's no cliff casts here, strangely, but more witches are marked above Nova Zembla and the Kara Sea, Franz Josef Land. At 62, the beauty of the aurora befuddles your senses. Move on another 5 spaces. That's on page, spot 61. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That would take you to 66. 2/3 of the way along, just above the Arctic Ocean, marked with stars and birds. The pack ice limit. Another windrose just behind us. We see the magnetic north pulls you onwards 5 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That would bring us to 73, the northern Nutansk of Greenland. That would skip over another windrose, and being fired upon by a hidden military outpost. In an effort to avoid being hit, you must throw again. Move on above Ellesmere Island. Creepy. Another windrose at 75, Svalbard proper at 76, and at 78 you anger a local witch as a poorly tied piece of ballast hits her camp. Move forward 4 spaces to evade her wrath. Again, the importance of craftsmanship and tying knots and staying on the right side of the witches. Above Severna Zembla, we cross into the 80s now. And we're getting dangerously close. An attack of snow blindness means you overshoot your stop for the night. Roll again and move on. 84, 85, 86, 87 is another windrose. And now we're just on the outskirts of the maelstrom proper, marked with heavy black ink splashed in all directions and scraped against this wonderful rubbable paper, this texture. So at 88, we've passed our last windrose. Oh, no, there's 2 more. Never mind. At 89, a localized storm hits your vessel. You are blown onward 5 spaces, and that would bring you into the maelstrom spots with 94. Just before that, it's the last windrose at 93. At 92, instrument failure. Total confusion ensues. Throw again. If you roll an odd number, go forward 6 spaces. If you roll an even number, go back 6 spaces. Wow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 would bring you to 98. So you'd be right at the perilous edge of 99, which is the very last spot before entering the pole, marked with skull and crossbones. All who enter perish. I don't know quite what to make of this included in here. I wonder if anyone out there has actually played it. Please tell me if you have. And I meant to look up some reviews. There are a few from board game aficionados and websites that talk about this. So it is a real game. It is playable. I don't know what opening it and punching out all these little objects has done to the value of my book. But I will say that it is, like I mentioned before, an uncanny bit of crossover between the storyteller and the game enthusiast. I have never seen a example of this before in any other book, where there's a playable board game included for the connection between the world described in the book and the experience of the reader / player. I've presumably some versions of Jumanji might be like that, a book which was made into a movie at one point, and there's probably some others as well. But quite like this, I don't think that Pullman is referencing or inspired by any particular other story. As I mentioned, there are a number of interesting parallels here with the chronology of this story. So this is meant to be played in autumn, when there's still frozen ice at the north. Of course, that becomes less and less true with every year as the ice melts. And this is, of course, a major concern in the Amber Spyglass and other books of Pullman's, this concern with climate change. Around 2007, when the book first comes out, Pullman is coming up on or rather, this book is released in 2008. In 2007, just before, the film for The Golden Compass had just been released, and there were efforts, particularly in North America, to boycott it, organized by Catholic I don't know if the institutional church proper or simply local churches and individuals were behind that. So this idea of a game or story that is too dangerous, or movie that is too dangerous to be seen, I think he's having a bit of fun at our expense there when he says this is too dangerous for children in particular. That is one of his great talents as a storyteller and as a teacher as well, to entice his listener by saying things like, this is too advanced for you. You won't like this. It's too exciting. It's too dangerous. This, of course, is a version of his great theme in his Dark Materials of innocence and experience, symbolized by a certain reading of the Genesis story in the Garden of Eden, temptation and fall of Adam and Eve. Now, there's other releases of this book, and part of why this has taken me so long to put together is because I tried to track down a few of those. I couldn't find the very new one by illustrations by Wormel, released in 2023, but there was another version in 2017 from the Yearling imprint, or at any rate, the copy that I found didn't have in it anything new, as was promised on the fandom website where I was reading about these different editions. There is no story included there about La Belle Sauvage, which at that point was about to be released. Rather, that edition that I had was a library one, and so, in fact, there was no board game included in it at all. And this is a question that I know must have been raised by any library that purchased this object. Well, if there's not just a map that unfolds and folds back in, stuck to the pages, but a board game that can actually be pulled all the way out and that has pieces that can be lost, how can we safely loan that as a library, right? And so I think that this new printing was made so as to avoid that problem without the board game included at all, which is a shame because it's part of the story and part of the book. But that's, again, another rather dim view of human nature for you. When I was looking up different editions, I found this blurb, which isn't on mine. My blurb goes like this, and this is, again, is the original edition. Another mesmerizing episode from the universe of his Dark Materials, including the very first meeting of those two legends and friends, Lee Scoresby, the Texan balloonist, and Yorick Byrnison, the armored bear. The Windrose appears there, compass. Set in the far frozen Arctic, Once Upon a Time in the North contains other teasingly authentic memorabilia and clues, together with a thrilling board game, Peril of the Pole, complete with spinner, game board, and pieces, all beautifully illustrated and rendered by master engraver John Lawrence. So, this other blurb, though, is interesting. It says something like, when Lyra is studying at Oxford University, she comes across the story of Lee Scoresby and Yorick Byrnison's first meeting many years ago, along with much evidence of the adventure that brought them together. And ellipses follow. That's an interpretation of what happens in the story. Lyra herself does appear in the form of some letters at the end, and I will hold those off until we get there. But it's intriguing that that might be precisely what the fandom editor mistook for a short story about La Belle Sauvage. Of course, that's a misreading of the first book of Dust as well, because Lyra's only a baby there. It's only quite a bit later in The Secret Commonwealth and the rose field that she's old enough to be studying. And even of that, I'm not entirely persuaded. I may be getting my chronology mixed up yet again, but I think that what we have at the end of Once Upon a Time in the North, these letters from Lyra, might well be something that only happens after her whole adventure is complete in the rose field. Um, Possibly, possibly. I'm not sure. I still have to map this out a bit better, and I still can't even wrap my head around the board of the Peril of the Pole, much less the rather thorny problems posed by geography in the Amber Spyglass in the original trilogy, to say nothing of the Book of Dust and all of the chronologies tangled like badly knotted ropes, or ones anyway that I don't know the knots to. Let's move on. So in the Oxford Union interview, 11 minutes in, you can hear Pullman talking about how his son suggested this story. It's worth watching that one, although the interviewer is, I think, a student, and it's a little bit hard to hear, actually, and a little, well, anyway, I don't want to overdo the preliminaries this time. I think we've already failed at that goal, but the cover this time is very beautifully illustrated with colors kind of delicately touched on there, just like the cover for Lyra's Oxford. The same beautiful texture, but a blue binding this time. And the picture, of course, is of Lee and Hester arriving in their balloon to Noviodensk, this town that is mentioned in the game, and becomes the setting for his encounter with Yorick Byrnison, as well as a dangerous feller from his past. These materials, as I say, are particularly enthralling, entrancing, enchanting to me because of the overlap between the story and the game, about which I've said enough for the moment. I also have a personal connection with this book. It is also signed. So my Lyra's Oxford copy I purchased at a Balticon fantasy sci-fi convention when I was a freshman or sophomore in high school, I guess. And when I was a senior in high school, when I was a senior in college, graduating college, that's when Once Upon in the North came out, A Time in the North. And I went to a signing that Pullman held in Virginia, in Tyson's Corner, Virginia, in the summer of 2008, I guess it must have been. He came and he gave a reading and he gave a signing. I think that my friend Ben and I got there a little bit late, although I can't distinctly recall. Or maybe it was the fact that we went around and bought a copy of the book first for him to sign. So Ben had him sign something. I had him sign the copy of Once Upon a Time in the North that I just bought. And I also brought for him one of my favorite books and his, The Magic Pudding by Norman Lindsay, a children's book full of rambunctious verse, songs, and stories. And he was amused, surprised, I dare say delighted. I don't think there can be many, if any, other readers who brought him that particular book to sign. He had written the introduction to a new edition of it, published by the New York Review of Books, I believe. And I still have that around here somewhere, too. So those are my signed copies of Philip Pullman. I think that's the full set now. There is a note about this in the Bridge to the Stars fan website that I was able to find. And as I was going down that rabbit hole, that ate up another, afternoon or two that I was meaning to actually be recording this. So I will include those links again as well. The project, like the maelstrom at the North Pole, spins and spins, and I don't know if I'll ever get out of it. Somewhere on there, there's a review of the book from when it first came out, and they note very astutely what I had missed or forgotten, which is that the title, though it seems like it's the traditional opening to a fairy tale, and that is that, Once Upon a Time, is also an allusion, quite clearly, I think, and irrefutably, to Once Upon a Time in the West, the great, perhaps the great, classic Western by Sergio Leone, the director of those so-called spaghetti westerns that my dad used to love so much. And I went ahead and I watched that too, so that ate up another chunk of evenings because I can't sit through a full movie anymore without getting distracted or falling asleep. Um, by stuff happening, stuff coming up, I'd gladly sit through if I had a couple of hours in a row. And fingers crossed that we'll get through this recording about it. But for that, you can find copies at your library or online, I believe. It's well worth the watch. It makes a great pairing with this story, and I think there are, in fact, not just overtones, homages in the sort of Western transposed to the far north that Pullman's up to, but specific little details too. Things to do with light and shadow, and trickery, deceit, bravery, of course, and the kind of enigma of personal identity, which is coming through in Lee Scoresby and his character, and always has for me. Here's another quote from Pullman. This is in an interview that he gives with Donna Freitas, I believe, who also has a book about him. So he says, Liar's Oxford and Once Upon a Time in the North, they're like an amuse-bouche, those little French hors d'oeuvres served at the beginning of a meal to whet the appetite. Each one is a short story, really, intended to divert and entertain. I'd always wanted to tell the story of how Lee and Yorick met for the first time. It was my son that wanted to know this story, actually. It was he who suggested that I write about how they first met, and I agreed it would be nice. Lee and Yorick are quite middle-aged by the time of his Dark Materials, and are old companions. I always start with a theme, and I discovered partway through that Lee's story is about honor, about the fact that he is an honorable man. There are a number of situations in the book when his honor is tempted. He's wounded, he's dirt poor, but he still behaves honorably, and he gains a great friend in Yorick. Now, that drew me up short because other places Pullman always says he starts with images. But I think if we understand theme correctly here, the theme in this sense is something more like the impulse, the purpose, the essence of the character, and for that to work with his images, I think is not such a big stretch as it would be if we thought of theme as something more like, beauty, death, something super vague like that. Because Lee's honor is a particular kind of honor, and it is inseparable from him the way a demon is inseparable from him, I think. But that would take a little bit more unpacking to clarify. And then he mentions there's a little hint about what Lyra is doing later on. I wanted to bring Lyra in tangentially at the end. She asks next, when can we hope to read the Book of Dust? He says it has had numerous holdups, principally because of the other things people keep asking me to do that prevent me from being single-minded about it. The filming of The Golden Compass took up a year of my life. I'm multitasking at the moment. I'm writing the comic, that's John Blake. I'm writing essays with political themes, a number of which do come from this time, and are included in Demon Voices and elsewhere. But a novel is more demanding than that. Oh, the word theme again, right there, political theme. Again, a different meaning of that word. A novel is more demanding than that. A novel is something that occupies all my time and all my attention to try to do many things at once. It's like asking an oil tanker to be a taxi. Where does he get these images? When I finish the story I'm writing for the comic, I'll say no to everything else. I wonder how many times I've said that now. And this reminds me of one of the original demons that we know of from philosophy, Socrates' demon, which always tells him no and helps restrain him. In the Oxford Mail, there's a note here about a literary conference or festival. After hearing the author discuss his work with Today presenter James Naughty, the queue stretched out of the main hall as fans waited for Mr. Pullman to sign their copy of the new pocket-sized book, which comes in the same format as the previous short story Liar's Oxford. Mr. Pullman told his audience he had to accept the label fantasy for his style of writing because his stories contained bears that talked. He added that he had helped to create the fictional seaport location for his latest story by stealing, in quotes, details from a book he found in Oxfam, the Shipping World Yearbook 1910. And so, of course, I looked up the Shipping World Yearbook 1910 and found a copy of it on Abe Books. Copyright of the image is MW Books for some reason. And it is a wonderful looking little object. I think a lot of the aesthetic and phono-aesthetic qualities as well are directly traceable to this um, find, this serendipitous connection with our world, our shipping world. Um, so again, I have to politely disagree with whoever edited the fandom page. At least in my case, I couldn't find anything about La Belle Sauvage other than these little hints at the end of Once Upon a Time in the North, which are exactly the same as the ones in the original printing, that Lyra is researching in her own right events from Lee Scoresby's past. Hmm. So, as far as the names, there's a lot to do with real life explorers, but for the film tie-in, I think we can also imagine that he's got Lee Scoresby on his mind because he gets a question here from someone in Lancashire, UK, Christy Rose. When they made the Golden Compass film, which character did they get just right? And he answers, Lee Scoresby. Sam Elliott was everything I'd hoped for. That's, again, just something I found down this rabbit hole of searching for the time and place in which this came out and what was going on with Pullman and what was going on in the world. I can't find it now, but I also turned up somewhere around the same time. His son also gets married, or one of his sons does. And there's a note there that Pullman actually read from the scriptures, from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, I believe it was, at the wedding ceremony. And there is, of course, a wedding, because this is a comedy in the old sense, a wedding promised at the end of this book as well. I think it is a consummation devoutly to be wished that Pullman himself would, of course, be reading in those scriptures. And it's not long after this that he gets back to retelling that story in a fairy tale-like mode or fantasy-like mode in The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ. Not exactly a companion volume, but one that I think is extremely important for understanding his larger project, much like Clockwork is, and, well, even his other fairy tales for that matter. So this brings us, I think, finally through all of the manner of preliminaries and ancillary documents that we could possibly want. Let's open up this book, and we see the hair, Hester, although what kind of hair is unclear at the beginning. The title card again, Once Upon a Time in the North, and then a balloon. I don't know which playing piece it is exactly, but a etching of a balloon over the port is the opening. And we see immediately that though this book is slim and only slightly longer in terms of page length than Lyra's Oxford, the type, or the font rather, is a bit smaller and a bit denser on the pages, such that the story itself is actually considerably longer than the story in Lyra's Oxford, and the mode of storytelling, the voice in which it's told, is likewise quite a bit different. We don't get this playful epigraph at the start. We don't get a kind of voice of the author / narrator coming in to tell us a little bit about where this story comes from, about the things included with it that have passed through the worlds. Instead, we jump right into the story, and it's a proper adventure story that we've got here. The opening line, the battered cargo balloon came in out of a rainstorm over the White Sea, losing height rapidly and swaying in the strong northwest wind as the pilot trimmed the vanes and tried to adjust the gas valve. The pilot was a lean young man. So, again, we're situated right there with a young Lee Scoresby above the site of his next adventure, and in some ways his first adventure in the North, because we're told quite early on here that he has just won his balloon 6 months before in Texas, and so he has been blown by the winds of chance ever since then until he's arrived here at Noviodenz, this port city, which corresponds with the Archangelsk of our world, more or less. We're told very early here about the sort of conflict that we're being dropped into as well. And whether this is pure chance or whether this is the nature of Lee Scoresby himself that's doing um, the impulse, the impetus for this adventure. Um, it's an economic, it's a political, and it's an honor sort of adventure. Again, there is a company um, that he is uh, put into contact with immediately. Um, there is a young woman that he is uh, encountering at a moment of crisis for her. And there is the question of whether it will be companies or individuals whose rights are protected and whose needs are best served by their governments. Um, the company is called Barents, so again, named for the sea. Um, and there's the mention of a torn scrap of paper, which in due course we will see an example of. It is um, uh, the instructions to the balloon that Lee is very dangerously piloting and landing without terribly great success. This appears a few pages into the story. On page 14, not the very first object from that world, because that, of course, is the Mont Julien brand of fine, special old pale cognac, shipped and bottled by Mattei Brothers, Thorshavn product of France, the Mont Julien. Its symbol is a ram with a crown above it and stars on either side. No, but the elements of aerial navigation, we have the final page and the notes to Chapter 6, and then Chapter 7, procedure for landing a balloon. There's a helpful diagram marked with force, velocity, and acceleration, the mass pointing down, resistance as a capital R, the sum of those forces pulling back up, and the very delightful bit of text here. Well, Chapter 6 ends, aerial navigation is no game for the reckless and improvident. Of course, this is precisely all leading up to and building up to that game that we started with. And then Chapter 7 opens with, once aloft in the Empyrean, with both gas and ballast in reserve, the aeronaut has little to fear. It is when he approaches the earth with a view to resuming his lowly status as a creature of gravity that the pilot of an aerial vessel encounters the first real danger of his flight. And yet, by taking the simplest and most basic precautions, he may safely and easily negotiate the perils of landing, and emerge from his craft with all the nonchalance proper to a prince of the air. This is where the page is torn. We can just read the first and most essential matter to bear in mind is... and then the text breaks off. So, a bit of humor there, a bit of playfulness, but also, again, a very different sort of voice. This voice of the professional, the amateur, the aeronaut, the history of competitions, the history of textbooks, for that matter, and a kind of technical language rather than the poetry or the cutting-edge experimental science, for that matter, that Pullman in other places tends to lean on. I think it's telling that his own father died in an air crash of some sort. That's the story that he grew up believing, at any rate. And it is important that that story, too, is in some sense broken off, or one that he doesn't seem to be concerned with investigating too closely to find out the truth of. When an interviewer brings this up in an interview around this time that I was reading, it was rather touchy, because Pullman, of course, is a bit private about certain elements of his own biography. So I'm hesitant to read that in too much here, but it may account for some of the playfulness as a kind of defense mechanism, or self-protection, even. The quote about the nonchalance proper to a prince of the air is one that the narrator uses directly in connection with Lee Scoresby's landing. Um, and I'm looking now again because I think that the actual strip of paper that he's looking at is perhaps a little bit different. Yes, it's a map, which we actually don't get included here. Yes, because it's showing us the location of the Barents Sea Company depot. It's the other scrap of paper I mentioned on the next page that is the actual tattered book, The Elements of Aerial Navigation, which his opponent in the poker game had thrown in free. The second half was missing. And that's where we're told that he's looking for work because his pockets now are again empty. So again, themes that come up here immediately: the fact that his jackrabbit demon looks like a jackrabbit, so the implication is maybe she's not exactly that. A little clue dropped by the narrator. These favorite words of Pullman's, laconic, things like a binnacle, a gondola, sardonic, are trotted out very early on here to set the tone. The idea of luck, of chance, as opposed to, say, destiny at one end or free will at the other. These are themes that swirl around Lee Scoresby throughout his Dark Materials as well. There's a very important passage where he's talking about the free will that he feels he has in discussing with Serafina Pekkala his role in this war that is going on, and which Lyra is involved in. There's the aesthetics, again, of those things that I mentioned before, but also of the Western. The genre that we're in is clearly a Western that has been dropped in to the north, and of games of chance and games of skill. The way that Hester and Lee interact is part of the fun of this book. She has a kind of mock severity with him almost at all times. And his own maturity is expressed here in his taking on of a role as the sort of hero or new sheriff in town that he plays, although quite what his goal is beyond that is completely unclear. Perhaps it's through expressing that inner equanimity, that sense of justice, that he is pursuing something that he doesn't even express quite clearly to himself. And I wonder, I know this is probably harping too much on a quote, but since it's quoted twice, this idea of being a prince of the air, quoted by the narrator on page 3. He worked for an hour or two to make everything secure, and then, assuming the nonchalance proper to a prince of the air, he sauntered over to the administrative building to pay for the storage of the balloon. And then again, that's a quote we find out directly from the very last lines of his half of the textbook. The Prince of the Air is unmistakably a reference of some kind to Paul, the Ephesians this time. I think it's chapter 2, verse 2, actually, where this idea of a spirit of the air as a name, a title for the adversary, Satan, right, is rewritten as Mary Malone on the one hand, as Lord Asriel on the other, but Pullman's reading of Paul, I think, is in some way the essential piece of that book, The Good Man Jesus and the Scoundrel Christ. The absence of an historical Jesus from his trilogy about the death of God and the freeing of humanity from the yoke of Christian church, if not of faith itself, I think is a glaring omission and a very conspicuous one, and one that the good man Jesus and the scoundrel Christ does not entirely satisfactorily um, fill in. And so, by associating Lee Scoresby with a kind of prince of the air, well, and then proceeding to give him all of the qualities of essentially a cavalier, a knight, right? Which is what these westerns tend to do. It's an incredibly interesting updating of old and properly Christian virtues in this popular cultural and subversive form that Pullman is so enthralled with. This free mixing of ideas, including talking bears and fantasy, but also, of course, the Norse sagas there. All right, we should probably move through the plot here a little bit more quickly. We have the mention of oil very early on. This is the linchpin of the economic side of this book. There is a company, Larson Manganese, with an appropriately chemical sort of name, a lot like that one that appears in The Secret Commonwealth, the pharmaceutical company, right? They're just as evil as, if not worse than, the church, it turns out. And Lee pretty quickly picks up on the fact that something is up with oil, with energy resources here, because two people ask him in quick succession. And they note that he has got a gun with him. His gun is jammed. It's not going to work except for one more shot, but that's enough. It's enough that he has it, that he carries it. They can tell that he is a fighter. The name of an oratory, St. Petronius, is mentioned. This is associating, of course, the power of the magisterium with all that Lee Scoresby is standing against, insofar as the church stands for oppression and he stands for freedom. We also are told that this is a pretty dirty town. There's the smell and this kind of industrial grime and effluvia of all of the people there. We don't see poor people so much, but we do in their place almost. We see the bears. Now the bears are impossible to read. Again, that problem of reading nature and reading feelings, seeing the unseeable. But they are clearly out of power. They are clearly oppressed, and they are being taken advantage of by the townspeople. We're told that there's a kind of class differential here, and this is something that Pullman gets into really clearly in the Sally Lockhart books, with a later hero in the story being a labor organizer. The fact that the townspeople take no notice, again, is a statement of their power in this dynamic, being able to ostensibly and rather carelessly ignore the suffering of others is the mark of the powerful and the mark of the corrupt for Pullman. Whereas Lee, of course, notices. And Hester points out that the people want to pretend the bears aren't there. But that's, of course, what is the clearest indication that they know that there is a real problem. This is going to be the foundation of the political message that we get very shortly here. There would be trouble to inquire about these things too closely, and that trouble is represented by the captain whose ship he can't release by paying its fee from the attentions of the officials. A Van Breda, a Flying Dutchman, I guess, is possibly what's behind that. Dutch captain. Now, there's almost a bait and switch that happens here, because we don't hear much about bears really in any specific way for quite a while. But they are, of course, a kind of mascot for Pullman's work as a whole. And so he brings them up early, gets them in front of us, and then sets them aside so that he can construct his plot more carefully with some other pieces that he needs in place. We have the mayor, Ivan Dmitrovich, um, and Polyakov is the last name, so politics, perhaps. He is the corrupt and demagogic politician. There's a journalist who has a butterfly demon, just like our other journalists that we meet at the party, the cocktail party. This one, Oscar Sigurdsson, fancies himself a poet as well. And this is where the Mont Julien comes in, as Lee buys him a drink to get some news and ideas about how he can make his way in this place. He very he has a kind of very flowery but transparently self-serving mode about him. Lee drops into a kind of parlance appropriate to this by calling his gun a revolvulator, pretending that he doesn't even know how to use it. And the poet Sigurdsson shows us the hate that underlies this ostensible disregard for the bears. He calls them savages, and brings up the idea that they are a dying race. They are the dregs of a dying race. He can admire their ability to make their armor, and he talks about the mythology behind that, of how they make their own armor a piece at a time as they grow to full maturity. He knows this from the sagas so he's not a poet in the sense that he writes poetry so much as that he can recite it, perhaps. A certain Ragnar Lokison of Svalbard, and Lee calls this a yarn, so a false narrative, a tall tale, but a story, of course. And Lee's interest in that becomes piqued. The barkeep himself is about to attack the drunk captain and kick him out, but Lee interposes himself and calls himself that man's guardian angel. This other meaning of the word demon, that great idea of Pullman's, that he's continually turning in different lights to explore. And so it's Lee who gets thrown out alongside Van Breda, but at least spares him getting hurt. He does this not out of any direct chance of benefiting himself, but out of a kind of better nature, perhaps. This is the first real indication that that is Lee's character deep down, bone deep. He's a good person, much as he's down on his luck right now. And this place is kind of a mixture then of Cittàgazze with its bars and its dangerous denizens, and the Trollesund that is the kind of gateway to the north throughout his Dark Materials. We're told about the Anbaric cranes. There's a description of the barrels that they're lifting, and that's what gets interrupted by those torn pages of the elements of navigation. There's some notes about the smell of fish oil, so just a little important detail that's dropped there. This kind of alternative to the rock oil, the chemical and petroleum power that is the underlying economic problem here. We meet a harbor master called Agard, maybe a play on the Asgard of the Norse gods. And we hear about his disdain for this ghost ship that Lee talks about seeing. And that has got to be on Pullman's brain because of, again, the Flying Dutchman, John Blake, his comic that he's writing concurrently with this, and that is taking up some of his time that really should be spent getting the Belle Sauvage going. Anyway, we hear about the problem of the bears being used by the politicians to try to get votes in the upcoming election, and how Lee can feel the reality of the bears, in contrast, coming up through the soles of his feet, the sound of their heavy, deep voices, a kind of duende or spirit, I think, a kind of energy that is over against the merely material energy that Pullman would claim to really trust in. There's a kind of bleak, again, smelly and unfriendly quality to this place. Lee calls it the most unfriendliest, but trusts that something will turn up. Nothing does the afternoon of this narrator's voice coming in so close to and really picking up the phrasing of Lee and Hester here in a way that Pullman feels free to do, it seems, in these companion books much more than he does in his more serious big trilogies. But after all, this is, as he says, meant to be entertaining. And so I don't know that we're doing it a disservice exactly, but we're certainly missing the mark in some way by reading in quite so closely here. But I just don't entirely trust him when he says that it's only for entertainment, because, as he says, to be truly entertaining, to be a truly good story, to be good literature, the goal is always also to teach. And he takes that from Dr. Johnson, I think. And he says it in a lot of ways and in a lot of places. But let's move on. So there aren't really chapters per se, but there's sort of these inset images that mark out different sections of the story. So that one was the hare, the balloon. This one's a bird. And this brings us to Lee's boarding house that he's found, because it's a parlor that's dismal, full of dismal religious books and dusty board games, including The Peril of the Pole. They're about to play it when instead we get some business between the people. So there's a photographer, again, a character drawn straight from Sally Lockhart books. There is a person involved with the Institute of Economics at Novgorod, and there's Victoria Lund, the librarian. And she's pretty as a picture. This is playing on that cliche, though, because it's a picture of someone rather severe. However, she is the first woman that he's had a chance to talk to in months. And so Lee tries to flirt with her. This is, of course, a integral part of the particular kind of honor that we are shown here. It's not the honor of total reserve and chastity or anything like that. No, it's the honor of the chivalric hero, the knight in shining armor who has the courtesy to talk to a woman. And it's the laconic form of that we get through the great spaghetti westerns and western films writ large. So he gets her to say 15 words as he talks about the place and her work and the people. Allen Square is mentioned, the strangers here, the possibility of some nighttime entertainment, and the others are impressed with his skill, his rhetorical skill, because that's more words than either of them managed to get out of her. And then they're almost about to play one of these games. He talks about a sporting persuasion, and that introduction to Lee in Trollesund with the Egyptians is to play at cards as well. This is his opening sally for friendship rather than for romance. Unfortunately, his new friends have other engagements, and one of those is for him to go along to. This brings us to the lamp section. We hear about the gas lamps, the light, of course, always a concern of Pullman's. Where's the light coming from? In this case, it's gas. And so we think again about the power that will raise the balloon at the end of the story. Lee's got his best necktie on, his only necktie, and he's excited because this is what people do for fun, it seems, is to go out to the political meeting. He's with Mikhail Ivanovich Basiliev, maybe something like Basilides, the alethiometrist for Lord Asriel. At any rate, there's been some sort of financial scandal in the past that this politician Polyakov is trying to come back from. There is again this mention of the the Larsen Manganese company, its security, its contrast, its conflict with the customs officials who are the proper servants of the people. There's mention of a rumor here of a great big gun of some kind that is under construction by the company, and this is a piece of imagination with its attached theme, coming straight out of the Sally Lockhart book, specifically the second one, The Shadow in the North, also called Shadow in the Plate in the original title. But there we have descriptions of just such a gun being built by the evil company, North Star Casings, or something like that, that is the kind of final boss of that book. Of course, in the scheme of things, just a mini boss, right? And this is, of course, just a mini story itself. So the theme being, of course, secrecy, the fear that even the powerful have when their true evil nature might be exposed, the threat that private interests, and not private in a good sense of one's biography or one's family or anything like that, but private in the sense of a corporation, right? Being able to overtake the just demands of the public at large, right? A public made up of truly free individuals, which is, I think, something close to Pullman's dream of the Republic of Heaven that he talks about later in those terms. We get it here in a form that's actually really close to his earliest books, like Galatea, where it's also this kind of financial, economic, political form of what later in his Dark Materials takes on more of a religious form. But this idea of oppression, of greed, really, being turned against the true needs of the people. Again, we have some flowery speeches given here where the poet introduces him to the politician's daughter first, so Polyakova, with the beauty of her eyes contrasted, her beauty as a whole contrasted with the severity of Miss Lund, the librarian. And Lee is completely smitten. He can't even really hear what the poet is saying after he starts looking at this beautiful girl, whose name is given a bit later, Olga. So her father is, of course, a very powerful man, but what Lee really wants is to have nothing to do with fathers. What he has in mind is something that the daughter is his only concern for. Twice we're told that he's a bit intoxicated, perhaps, and while the father talks about progress and justice, that is rather far from what Lee has in mind at this moment. So the problem is brought up here again about the outer versus the inner, because this girl, she seems rather dull, actually. She doesn't get his joke about the grizzly bear, and it feels like he's missed the bottom step in the dark. Again, this idea of language and humor being a pretty clear connection to the ways in which storytelling and the reading of truth happen with the alethiometer, because of course that idea of going downstairs in the dark is one that Lyra uses for her reading process. Whatever all of that is, this girl seems to lack it, or to have it in a very small degree. So as beautiful as she appears, she lacks the kind of inner beauty and true worth of a fully developed human in the way that someone with their demon severed is disconnected from their true humanity. Her father, of course, is trying to use the people's fear of the bears, again, this animality or this otherness, as a way to smooth his own path to political power. This girl's name, Olga, again, is given here kind of in passing, possibly a reference to, say, the great Eugene Onegin of Pushkin. And it's mocked how the appearance of the politician is something he's probably practiced in a mirror, but again, there's there's no real sincerity or friendship possible there. Um, this is on of a piece with Pullman's critiques of politicians in general. Really, um, they leave him wanting, at least at that time in Britain. Um, and there's a kind of connection here made between the way that the speaker is engaging the audience with his flamboyancy and the way that a preacher would. It's called preaching. I think this is Lee's sort of sardonic take on it. Um, so one of the great lines in the story, though, comes here where, although Olga has got a brain of a grape, Lee at this point is again smitten with her body, and intelligence has little to do with the matter. Um, the fact that he uh, thinks in terms of their bodies having a great deal to say to one another is a kind of uh, play on that idea of language as being core to the truly human, um, and moving back a step to again a more physicality, a more animality, of which we also partake. Um, in terms of the persuasion, then, that the politician has, nothing that he has said, nothing that he has shown in his speech really matters. It's this other person that Lee's interested in. And so he sticks around, and we have the cigar chapter, or section. Um, the elder father calls his daughter a sweetmeat, which is pretty gross. And this is where we get a glimpse of the cannon on its armored truck. Again, exactly like the sort of thing that's described in Shadow in the North as a steam gun. We'll see this one in action as well before too long. There's kind of a handshake contest that happens here, which only drops the politician in our estimation. While he is full of propaganda, he's also not afraid to use force. It becomes clear that he wants to hire Lee to be his muscle, or to help with some problem he has with some disputed property at the harbor. And then we glimpse the true antagonist behind this particular story, which is the gunfighter called Morton, who's leaning against the side of the room in a very nonchalant way of his own. But there's a kind of reputation that surrounds this man, as Lee puts it, from back in his past. And because he recognizes that he's taken a false name, where really it's Maconville that he was called before, he says that he has got keener eyesight. There's a lot that's unstated in their encounter here, but the way in which the two of them are measuring themselves is rather different than the overt sort of strength represented by that handshake contest right before. It's a different kind of contest that has a lot more to do with the intellect, the eyes, the memory, what one would call soul or spirit, if Pullman were amenable to that. What he calls dominance, right? This leaks away in the moment when the girl starts talking about the cake again, and puts them all on safer ground for the moment. But Lee refuses to work for anyone who has brought such a man into their pay. This man with the rattlesnake demon, this gunfighter, he will not be an alter ego or a party to such a dastardly fellow. And so he has a pang of regret, but he drops his suit of the beautiful daughter of that swaggering blowhard senator, and this possible friend of this poet and journalist. The gun section is very short. We just get a bit of the background here um, behind his first encounter with this dangerous man. Um, Again, we should be worried for Lee because he hasn't taken care of his gun. He hasn't been a good craftsman. He isn't yet the mature aeronaut that we'll see later. But this is part of his transformation. There's oil everywhere and not a drop to fix the mechanism of his handgun. Possibly a little bit of a play on the water everywhere and not a drop to drink of Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. We're told that this killer has 20 murders in the Dakota country. He was last seen in Rapid City where the gendarmes had caught him, but he got away through false testimony, shot the witness who dared to speak up against him, and sent the rancher home to Chicago, right? Chicagoa, I guess maybe the version of the city of big shoulders in Lyra's world. He says he was a damn fool to provoke him, but there's nothing they can do about it now, and after all, there's nothing human in those eyes. So a dangerous person who has to be dealt with. Can't run from him. The candle chapter. This is where we see Lee interacting with a different young woman, not perhaps the one that he would have chosen himself, but in this moment he discovers the depth of her character and her quality. So it's in the moment when he's going to the bathroom at night that he hears the sobbing down the hall, and he can't help but hear and to know that he has overheard the distress of young Miss Lund. In the candlelight, her appearance is rather different. She has a kind of inscrutability rather than severity. She has a beautiful smell about her of lavender, and she's just closed this journal that she's been looking at. And she fixes him with a courageous look now and frames a question about honor. They have this discussion about how hard it is to get right. And I think this is pretty close to Pullman's understanding of the virtue of classic novels, of the Dickens or Austen sort, that he wishes he could write. The George Eliot Middlemarch. That it teaches us things about honor that we can only learn otherwise through our own experience and mistakes. But it teaches us true things about how to get those right rather than have to get them wrong and learn from them that way. They talk about who and importantly, whether it is only her or whether it is someone else who wants this thing unnamed yet, but clearly a romantic sort of proposal to come to pass, and how to disentangle or to weigh one's own wants against one's wishes for someone else and for their wants and desires. This is judgment. This is the tough question here. And whether one is harming someone more by acting or by not acting. The phrase that comes out of this that I think is kind of equal and opposite to his thing about having something to say to Olga with his body is that Lee perceives the sweet overcoming of the young body's clumsiness, and she is, he recognizes, a treasure. Nothing like that vapid doll. Again, shades there of literal dolls that are alive in Galatea or have a kind of life to them. Galatea being Pullman's early novel, which he seems to be continually rewriting along with his first published novel, Haunted Storm, in various ways throughout his career. And it becomes clear that this is about a proposal of marriage, in fact, and Lee says that he hopes he's gotten it right, as of course he has, as we learn later. This brings us into the longest and most action-packed of the sections of the book, headed by the binoculars. So it becomes clear here that Miss Lund has a sweetheart in customs, so that's the identity of her lover, her fiance. Um, there's the word maelstrom, but rather than a literal or imaginary maelstrom at the center of the North Pole, leading to the center of the Earth, like some sort of a relic of Lucifer's fall being cast down, hurled into the center, and encased in ice in Dante's vision. Um, or for that matter, the maelstrom of a Poe story, right? Which Toni Morrison writes about in her Playing in the Dark. Rather, this maelstrom is the maelstrom of politics. Again, Hester warns Lee against betting, against taking unnecessary risks, but that is possible to totally restrain, being so central to his character. And we have this rather odd word bollard, which appears again, making a kind of secret thread between Once Upon a Time in the North and Lyra's Oxford, where Lyra sets out on her own action-packed section of that story after a description of the bollards in Oxford, of all places. So this is where the actual image of the field glasses appears. And again, there's that problem of sight, of vision, of seeing, which becomes kind of the theme, really, of the Book of Dust, where innocence and experience was the overt theme of his Dark Materials. And Philip Pullman says this explicitly in his Blake lecture, really. We have a dredger. That's something that we hear about, the river not being maintained properly by the River Board in La Belle Sauvage. And this ghost ship, or so-called, this schooner that is silently waiting there and very sadly cannot be set free. So this is where Lee notices the bear. The bear, right? This is Yorick. We have another inclusion now of the objects, or rather a quote that will become important for the object that is next included, where we're told the actual date. So we can start to do our detective work, our sleuthing of the chronology. This is April 16th, or rather, that's tomorrow. So this is the 15th when all of this is happening. April with his showers sweet, right? The kind of generative force, and April the cruelest month in Eliot, misquoting or misprision of Chaucer there. It's also mentioned that this bill of lading, this object that we see, has got a kind of smudge over the actual year. So we can't narrow down our timeline exactly. We know we're in the 19-somethings, and Lyra will help us with that in a little bit. But the name of the ship, the Mary Alice, I think has got to have some resonance as much as it's a kind of cliche pairing of female names. Mary, on the one hand, being the mother of Jesus, and related to stars, and Lyra's own mother, Stella Maria, also with the same connection there, Lord Asriel's demon, and then Alice, of course, Alice in Wonderland, and the Alice who becomes Mrs. Lonsdale. There's a mixture then of hope and of despair, of seriousness, of comicness, of whimsy and imagination, all folded up in this one little document, which is ostensibly so dry and technical in nature, the Bill of Lading, with all its different handwritings and notes and things scrawled in different hands. Then we get the bear speaking. He says one word. He says, "you." And Lee can tell he's a young bear, or thinks he can. The bear says something that the Egyptians will also say about how they can form alliances. It's through shared enemies, right? Because his enemy is my enemy. And Lee gets the name of the bear quite wrong. He calls him York Burningson, and that will be kind of a running gag here for a bit. And we're told that at this point the bear has only one piece of armor, a helmet that looks clumsy but is not. And this is Kleist, right? This is the fencing with the bear. And this, of course, is also the piece of the armor that Will shears into with the knife later, kind of finding Yorick's weak spot. Because the bear is afraid of some things, and can, in some sense, be tricked, although he perceives more clearly than humans know how to. Again, there's this kind of audible intake of breath as the bear emerges in his full power. He cannot be ignored. We're remembering then that the poet just called these bears such names, and called them poison indeed. But now suddenly the odds are a bit better, because he has a companion. He has a powerful teammate. And this is where also Lee will acquire his rifle. So the problem of his gun is solved by getting him a new item, essentially, a new weapon. So there's a delivery here of not just a new character, but an item, a piece of equipment that will in turn, in some way, symbolize Lee himself, right? His full flowering as his maturity of as the hero that he is. But there's a bit of persiflage first, like this attorney speak, this way of talking about unreasonable provocation. Again, we're here with oratorical flamboyancy. So the kind of misuse of language, or the play of language, which is covering over something rather serious. An encounter, a moment that's going to be of supreme importance for both of these characters. We're told that just as Lee has keener sight than Morton or Maconville, so Hester has hearing such that she can pinpoint an ant on a blade of grass. There's a click, and he knows exactly who has aimed and fired, even before they send the bullet whizzing over his head. The crowd of the crew and the gas gun are bringing together, on the one hand, the source of the politician's power among the people, and the source of the corporate power in unchecked violence and its technological advancement. A little word here that I don't know the meaning of, but seems important. The lazaret, a part of a ship, I guess, where the gun is kept. And Lee exclaims, "Sweet Aunt Betsy!" It's a Winchester, right? It's the finest gun there is, the one that kills so many people that the owners have to build extra rooms in their mansion to try to lead the ghosts away, right? The ghosts of the killed away from them. So one of the most famous haunted houses, the Winchester Mansion. California, maybe? Anyway, here we have the gun tossed into the water. He doesn't need any other weapons besides this and his trusty pistol. And there's one of those moments when Pullman's typography, his use of commas, actually seems to function not grammatically but rhetorically, or dramatically rather. So it's one of his more awkward sentences. This is when the gun goes off and the shell skips across the water. It exploded with a plume of water, and rock hurled high into the air, scattering the ship's crew and the crane driver. Right. So I don't know quite what to make of that, whether it's a typo or, again, intentional dramatic use of the comma. But again, we have this idea of sauntering, of lightness, of confidence restored. And we come to the warehouse. This is the climax of the story. The confrontation between Lee and McConville. Scoresby, of course, we know is going to survive, so it's not so much tense because of that, but it's the question of how. How is he going to make it out of this alive? Because he is outgunned at first. Yorick is able to open the door for him by feeling for qualities of the metal. Again, this is kind of a recapitulation of things that we see in the Golden Compass. And they have to take out the sharpshooter first. And there's a kind of play on that with Lee firing at a very specific spot that Yorick marks with an X on the door, and then it falls in with a push. Again, this image of a ghost coming from somewhere in a kind of clutch of a ghost here. That's the feeling of a bullet whizzing by. And then the trick is played of putting his hat on the end of his rifle and lifting it up to trick the shooter who's covering that approach. This is one of those moments that is taken possibly directly from Once Upon a Time in the West, where one of the figures of that film, I think his name is Cheyenne, is the one who has his gun hidden inside of his boot. And so as his boot comes down, they think they're going to be able to catch him easily, but in fact it's his hand inside holding his gun that shoots the bandit in the face through the window of the train. So I don't know if Pullman has quite surpassed his source material here. I really think he hasn't, but at any rate he's making a creative use of it with this idea of putting the hat on the rifle. And then we get the description of the situation, right? It's hopeless. It's a bunch of barrels. It's Lee has only his mirror of a smoke leaf tin lid to try to see what's going on. But as he says, like every other situation he's been in, and he's still here, he's still alive. So that power of vitality of life that he also seems to represent closely connected with his mode of being, which is brave, which is honorable and heroic in a kind of classical sense. So under the cover of noise, again, we get the voice of a ghost, and the feeling of nausea that comes over him in a choking outrage when the man dares to grab his demon. He has to kill first that sort of unnamed, or at any rate miniature obstacle in his confrontation with this bigger force of evil represented by the particular form of McConville. A criminal, and as it turns out, a sadistic one. We get the description now of the columns that hold up the warehouse and the kind of light and shadows between them. This is the other really key image, I think, that Pullman takes from a similar moment, although I don't think it's the same scene. It's an earlier one on the train where Harmonica himself, like the hero of that film, is sneaking along the top of the train and thinks that he is safe as a result. But in fact, those inside can see his shadow projected against the bank of the newly built railroad. And so, same here, Lee thinks that he's able to sneak by, but realizes too late that the man has been able to trace his progress by watching his shadow the whole way. He gets hit, goes down with a kind of tiger bite. So there's your William Blake, the tiger, against his ear. And he has a slug in his shoulder, and he's by the fish oil. This is an image that Pullman dwells on at length in his essay on Poco a Poco as the image of the source, la source. But of course it's a kind of comic version of this rather than water and inspiration. The fountains of the poets on Helicon are or wherever, it's fish oil. But it's exactly what Lee needs in this moment for his particular problem, which is that his gun barrel, because he's dropped the rifle now, he has his trusty old pistol, and he has to lubricate the barrel so it will fire. Um, Meanwhile, the terrible gunslinger is trying to torture him by telling him how he cracked other men's demons like a whip back at the Cheyenne River. So again, the name Cheyenne perhaps comes in here. Um, he says how it ain't good odds that he had one man tied to his horse, holding his demon elsewhere, and when the horse named Sunshine finally took off, it ripped him apart from his demon. So again, the great taboo against touching demons, it seems, has been broken long before. Even we might say it's a form of innocence itself to believe in that taboo and in the power of that taboo. Long before Lyra's terrifying encounter with the staff of Bolvangar. It's a kind of monologue too that made me think of those modern westerns of Cormac McCarthy, those kind of apocalyptic westerns that he writes. I don't know if that's something Pullman would have been drawing on. But here we have a kind of evil form of play. McConville wants to play with Lee and Hester for a long time. And then finally Lee and Hester kind of figure out the way that they can get out of this by using the oil. They check their memories once more. This feeling of the turf, of the sage lands of his home comes to him, as it will later at the Alamo Gulch, the final standoff of this kind that he has. But it's a successful encounter here, where his enemy becomes a face like dirty paper, a kind of inversion of the image of the authority as being as fragile as paper, and his mouth a red hole. Again, this kind of horrible Goya in the black paintings, right, of Saturn devouring his children. Lee names those men that he knew that were killed back in the Dakota country: Mike Martinez, Brodus Vinson, Jimmy Bartlett. And this is the final piece that I guess Pullman directly takes more or less from Once Upon a Time in the West. This face-to-face final revelation that happens for the antagonist of all people, when they finally understand the nature of the hero that they have been defeated by. In the case of Once Upon a Time in the West, it's Harmonica having a vision of his brother being killed very cruelly, and in this case it's Lee speaking those names and then shooting his evil pursuer through the heart. Now, this brings us to the kind of denouement of the story, with Polyakov almost snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. He is surrounded by his crowd of supporters, but as Lee points out, it would take a madder, braver crowd to stand up to himself and Yorick. Now, Larson Manganese tries their hand, but they are opposed in a almost allegorical manner by Lieutenant Hoagland. High land or hill land or something is what his name means. He has the moral high ground here, and he faces down the security forces of the corrupt company. There's the mention of marionettes, so again this allusion more or less directly to Kleist. And the rifle, the Winchester, is given to Lee as a gift for his service to Van Breda, who is now free to escape in his ship at last. Now, there is a kind of hangover from the battle. Now Lee is getting dizzy from the loss of blood. He has to be caught once again by his fellow. In this case, I think it's Hoagland, but before it was Yorick catching him. So twice in quick succession, we see that Pullman has a different idea of the hero than the literal, Wild West sheriff in town sort of thing. No man is an island, right? They do need to work as a team. As much as he seems to believe in an older sense of inner strength and heroic virtue, there has to be some dependence on a crew around him, right? The bear and what he represents. On the one hand, this character whose nature is such that he can perceive truth, much as Lyra does with the alethiometer. And so long as he is true to his nature, he cannot be deceived, right, Yorick? And then on the other hand, Hoagland, who, for whatever reason, wasn't able to convince Miss Lund to marry him directly, but required the help of Lee in turn. And Lee finally starts to understand quite what he's up, I was about to say against, but only in the sense of being up against, being held up by the lieutenant here at the very end. Again, he knows what a treasure Miss Lund is, and he understands now that he has been integral in her happiness and her fiancé's. So the final image is of Yorick diving into the water, moving the seals away from him. They come to the Barents Company depot again, where the balloon is held. And Hoagland describes this literally as a microcosm of what's happened here, of the larger struggle between the public and domineering private companies without democratic sanction. So more talk here of honor, of the kind of theme being made explicit, not in quite the same way as in Lyra's Oxford, but through the story itself and through the narration, as well as the dialogue and the characterization. We have another word that stands out to me. I don't know what to make of it exactly, but the use of a very unusual meaning for mole as a structure, unusual to me at least, like a jetty that breaks up the waves at a pier or dock area, where this is the first introduction then of blood moss. So something that will become very iconic with respect to the bears and their connection with Will and the witches, of course. So blood moss being used here by Lee's medical man, so-called Yorick himself. That's what he's gone to get through the water. The final bit of humor comes in the form of an interview held by the journalist with Lee. And he points to him, a spot out on the horizon, and then kicks him in the derriere, and so that he falls into the icy water. We see Vasiliev coming up, and they think there might be no way out, but of course there is one way left, and that is up. They finally have their names corrected. So all has been made right with respect to the economics, right? Vasiliev's concern. With respect to the truth, we'll see the journalists' write-up of this event, but we at least have the truth, the true perspective on it in our heroes. And their names, which they've been calling each other by the wrong names throughout, finally they take the moment to give the corrected form so they can properly be introduced, really. He feels how the balloon is impatient to be aloft, much as he feels that the rifle was made for him. This kind of personification of objects, this animism in things with a kind of intention of their own, is very resonant there. The theme of honor, of course, with its flip side of trust, right, of interpersonal trust in relationships between honorable people. Is made explicit as well. And we finally get the revelation, perhaps not quite as dramatic as that given to McConville, but that the nature of Lee's demon is not what he had thought, a jackrabbit, but rather Hester is an Arctic hare and always has been. So again, around this time, the wedding between Hoagland and Lund, right, is promised, and in real terms, the wedding between Pullman's son and his fiancée took place in a church with Pullman reading from St. Paul's letters to the Corinthians. Um, and so finally, the last image we get, the inversion of the beginning, which was the rather careless, nonchalant landing, but without skill, and now, like a living thing in a rush of speed that they loved, the three of them take off. Well, the bear's afraid, but that will be settled rather later with the fear conversation between him and Lyra in the Golden Compass, as he talks about mastering his fear. So we see an example of that happening. The field glasses, the ships, are mentioned one last time in a kind of receding view, and we hear about that the high regard that he wishes to have of the bears, a lesson that he has learned from this too, to take care of his materials, right, of his craft. He learns it well enough that 35 years later he will be holding that Winchester rifle in his hands when he dies, protecting Lyra at that final stand. The last word, though, is Hester's, right? She knew that she had more class. She always knew she had more class than a jackrabbit. And the final image after the end is the sprig of lavender as an illustration. So there is a very brief, if you want to call it that, scenario or scene with the hare as the heading image, followed by the lavender that closes it out, just as the hare started it all off. So something to do with, the natural world, our senses, and as Blake says, the improvement of sensual delight. It doesn't mean simply hedonism, right? Because that would be the Olga, right? The beautiful exterior, but the vapid doll. Rather, it's this image of Victoria Lund, the one who got away because she was already taken, and because the honorable thing was, of course, to help her make up her mind to belong to the one who loved her and that she loved. In that sense, Lee too has had more class than he might appear to. He might look like a desperado and a gun for hire. He is a ladies' man, but he's not depraved. He's not, or at least not always. And so we see him flirting with the witches, but also receiving the boon of the witches' flowers. Anyway, certainly one of the great characters in Pullman's work, a loving kind of reflection of the bear, which is the kind of mascot of the work, but in human form. And this longest scene of his battle, punctuated with the revelation to his nefarious alter ego, then followed by this shortest scene of the hare and the sprig of lavender, the bookends there. It sort of contributes to the rhythm of the pacing throughout, which is masterful. I don't think there's any other way to say it. And the way in which these little illustrations and items are distributed. Like in Liar's Oxford, they are mostly washing up here at the end of the book. So though we had the Mont Julien brand of the cognac, and though we had the bill of lading, we don't get another here until the very end, which is the Peril of the Pole. So those rules for the Peril of the Pole, the board game that they didn't play, but that we are invited to play, not in a dusty old form in a dingy boarding house, but in our sun-drenched living room or parlor or wherever it is that we happen to be when we're reading our lovely edition that we have purchased, right? But there's a kind of sadness to that too, right? Because on the one hand, it's almost too nice to play. I certainly have never played it because I'm trying to maintain its qualities for the future. And as part of my valuable copy of this book, maybe unique when you pair it with the others. But I do also wonder about the problem of letting a reader, say, enjoy the adventure, be entertained by it, and then be left with this this version of the story, which is, after all, a kind of um, light reduction of the true story that takes place in the Golden Compass. When you get to your destination, if you're Roger, you die, thinking that you've been rescued by Lyra. In fact, you've been brought to your death. Um, and that betrayal at the heart of her journey, of course, is matched by the end in the land of the dead, and then finally at the parting from Will and from the the gateways between worlds represented by the knife. Um, this is something that Pullman seems to still be working out the consequences of, really, in the Book of Dust. But what is the nature of the gateway between worlds? Is it a harbinger of death, right? Of the separation of one's soul from one's body? Um, is it for the purpose of destroying dust and destroying the authority, as if those were the same thing? Um, or is it representative of basically what happens when we read stories, right? Is it a kind of serious play of the imagination that allows us to communicate across the worlds of which we are the sole denizens, the worlds of our own experience, or innocence, as the case may be? Um, and the bringing of people safely through those gateways is the hard thing, right? That requires honor, bravery, courage above all, and trust. Um, and so there's, the playfulness of the game that seems to, in a way, undercut the seriousness of the themes at stake. But I think, again, that Pullman is being a bit misleading, right? Just in the way that he says this is too exciting. In the same way he's saying this is just entertaining. This is just a amuse-bouche. I think it's more than that. And I hope that I am persuading someone else other than just myself as I talk through this. The next page is from the Shipping World Yearbook. Again, I don't have a copy of this, but I imagine that the language and the entries are very much like what's in the real-world version of it that he found. We have an entry on Novorossiysk, Russia, and we have an entry on Noviodensk right after that, so that's the actual location of the story, and then one on Nyborg, Denmark. And there's something interesting about these, I think, actually, which is that the coordinates seem to correspond, so like I said, to Arkhangelsk, Russia, in our world, which is on the mainland with the White Sea and the islands nearby. So maybe this is an invented island or something, because it doesn't seem to really be on the mainland. They talk about how hard it is to get supplies, right? Whereas the other, Novorossiysk, Russia, is actually a place somewhere somewhere near Turku, Finland, in our world. So whereas this describes a rising port on the Caucasian coast of the Black Sea, so there is a Novorossiysk in our world, but it's not at that coordinate. So either the coordinate is wrong, or there's some sort of playful joke. Pullman does give a talk at a sci-fi convention in Finland and receives some awards. And so maybe he's making a reference to those places with those coordinates. Indeed, the Black Sea is not at 60 degrees 47 minutes north and 21 degrees 24 minutes east, but rather at 44 degrees 43 minutes north and 37 degrees 47 minutes east, if Wikipedia can be trusted. Nyborg, Denmark, a word that means something like Newcastle, might make us think about New Denmark. I don't know if that's just a nod to Lee Scoresby's origins in Texas and the Sage Lands again. Probably that's just reading in too much. It's just another place with an N name that Pullman could find in the north. And then we get the newspaper article, or a clipping from it. Looks like it could be on microfiche or something. Shocking affair at harbor. 2 men slain in warehouse shooting. Villain and accomplice bear. Flee by balloon by our special correspondent Oscar Sigurdsson. Um, so a kind of muckraking article, uh, rather yellow journalism, with Lee's name misspelled as Lee Scroby, and the bear again called Savage, with the aspersion of their escaping on legalistic grounds. So again, trying to undermine the authority justly sanctioned by the public government with these aspersions. And then there's a kind of a irony here, calling Lee an assassin when, of course, he takes out the murderous McConville. The description of his pistol as being well tended, showing how foolish Sigurdsson really is. And um, and then the men slain, though they're part of the heading, the title, to get people to read this. Before there was clickbait, there were screaming headlines, but they aren't named exactly the way that Lee names the men before he takes out McConville. There's a bit of buttering up of Polyakov here. We're talking about his proofs of far-sighted wisdom. This is just the sort of thing that the anti-bear policy is meant to prevent. And he himself has an article mentioned here in the Novioden's Courier and Telegraph, page 7. But that is not included. Instead, what we get next, the final couple of items included, all relate to Lyra. There's 3 of them, actually. 2 of them are letters. And so the first, an 18th of October date to a Tom. Again, this name is used so many places that I don't think we can say for sure who this Tom is. But Malcolm, as a boy, has a friend named Tom. And Tom Nugent would have been probably too old and could not possibly be the one that she's writing to. But I do think that it's the name of Pullman's son, if I'm not mistaken, too. So anyway, it sounds like somebody that's a friend of Lyra's, around her same age, and that she's close with. She's talking about her work on her thesis or dissertation. She says it's going to have to be econ hist, because there simply isn't any way of examining what I know about the alethiometer. And so, while she mentions that Dame Hannah, Dame H, is an expert, she actually is surpassing her at this point. And there's a kind of emphasis on the word private. All right, I'll have to keep that privately, well, privately, versus the public, or in this case economic history, sort of knowledge. There's this play on the private and the public once more here, with the form of the clear documents, nice and clear documents that she can draw on, as well as her personal knowledge. And because ultimately she's practical and she wants to be able to teach, she doesn't want to trust that people will continue learning the alethiometer, and so she'd rather teach about patterns of trade. She has a title, Patterns of Trade in the Arctic Region, with particular reference to independent cargo balloon carriage, 1950 to 1970. It must be a winner. Yours, L. She signs. The next letter is a bit different. It goes to Dr. Polstead. Dear Dr. Polstead. Oh, and this one is dated Tuesday, 2nd January, which, if we use our calendars, we can start to pinpoint possible dates with. So let's do that real quick. There's a date that falls on a Tuesday, January 2nd, in 2001. There's another in 2007. And then when you put that together with the day and date given in Lyra's Oxford for the cruise timetable as a Monday, May 11th, there isn't one of those that falls between 03 and 04, but there is one in 2009. You can do this. You can watch this date move along the different days of the week, and it jumps. It doesn't happen to be, there is no May 11th on a Monday, where there should be, if you're following the calendars, between 2003 and 2004, but it finally does appear in 2009, so a couple years after the later of the two options for what this Tuesday, 2nd January might be. This would put the events of His Dark Materials roughly in the late 90s, and then in turn the events of La Belle Sauvage 10 years earlier in the late 80s, and that would make each of the books of His Dark Materials roughly contemporaneous with its publication. And that's helpful in a way because that lines up with the kinds of technology that we see. No cell phones or anything like that. But I think this is maybe some work that we will need to do in a little bit more careful detail another time. Or we can simply say that it doesn't line up with dates and days in our worlds. At any rate, this letter is about some questions of the bibliography that Lyra has for her thesis advisor. She talks about having scraps of ephemera, and she misspells the word and crosses it out and writes it again, including some bits and pieces, like cutting from a newspaper, anywhere in Oxford or England for that matter available, and it won't be easy for the examiners to check. Some of my bits and pieces, she says, are precious for personal reasons, but I dare say that examiners will be careful to return them intact. And so we get a picture of what's happened here is that these objects have somehow slipped out of her world and into ours through the care or lack thereof of her examiners. And then the final object before the game board itself is the certificate for dissertation submitted in master's courses in the Faculty of History. So somehow this also went astray, but she is candidate number 23, named Lyra Silvertongue, College St. Sophia's, and the title of her program, MPhil in Economic History, the title of her dissertation, Developments and Patterns of Trade in the European Arctic Region, with particular reference to independent cargo balloon carriage 1950 to 1970. The number of words, 28,950, and then the assertions, declarations of not using anything but her own work, not having presented it for any other degree, and not exceeding the limit, including footnotes but excluding bibliography, and any appendices, passages quoted in another language. Which draws attention a couple of times, I think, to the fact that if there really were such an article in a paper, it couldn't possibly have been in English, right? And throughout this whole story, not once do we hear about people speaking in Russian or whatever dialect, Finnish or something like that might have been used in such a place. That's just not a problem for this sort of story, I guess, and that again is part of what Pullman is able to do by dismissing it in a way as entertainment. This is precisely not the sort of thing that a great fantasy writer like Tolkien would have tolerated, but just the sort of thing that C.S. Lewis would play with. And so that 28,000 words, almost 29, probably corresponds roughly to the number of words in the story. I'm basing that on a really barely mathematical counting and then multiplying out. But if there's about 24 lines with about 10 words each on each of these 100 pages or so, that gives us, give or take, 24,000 total words. Then you throw in whatever words are included in the appendices, right? And you get your total. So I think that's a bit of fun that Pullman's poking at himself and at his main character Lyra here. In a way, what we have instead of a dissertation is a story which captures some of the same themes. And as I've said from the very beginning, this story is unique in Pullman's work and really in any writing that I'm really aware of, in that it includes a game as well. The Peril of the Pole, a game that we win not by going the fastest to get to the end, but by taking our time, by enjoying the kind of flavor text that is included and thinking about the mechanics of the game and how they do and do not serve the purpose of the game, right? Because Pullman is all about how objects have intentions and how, stories through the narrative voice have a kind of givenness of their own, right? They come from somewhere to him and through him. And I think that gameplay is much the same. We enter into a certain role, which we play, and which, in a way, plays back against us. In this case, a large amount of the inspiration, of course, is coming through Once Upon a Time in the West, but that in turn is really transmitting much older ideas, right, from the genres of medieval romance and such, through this pop cultural form of film westerns. And I think that Pullman is really aware of that and really playing with that here. I think that for all of his being down on video games, it's probable that he hasn't really encountered video games that do storytelling of the sort that role-playing games, Japanese role-playing games and others do, and that is a kind of storytelling that I think would be impeccably matched with his own storytelling qualities. So I haven't given up on my dream just yet of adapting his stories in some way for the video game medium. So there's a few more notes that I have here. This is a long passage from Kristen Poole in her recent book on Pullman's historical imagination. She says, "While the significance of many demons is obvious, sometimes a person's demon can reveal truths about themselves that they didn't even realize." Right? So in this case, the transition from the jackrabbit that she appears to the Arctic hare, which she is, right? Burton in the Hieroglyphica writes, "The Egyptians therefore in their hieroglyphics expressed a melancholy man by a hare sitting in her form, as being a most timorous and solitary creature." Pierre's Hieroglyph 1:12. And the reference is coming here in the context of Burton's somewhat random account of how to recognize a melancholy man. She says, "Might we find shades here of Lee Scoresby? Although he isn't melancholic in the way that Hamlet might be, Scoresby is something of a sad figure, a loner who has lost his many sweethearts." Right? And so in this case we see, as she says, that he arranges the marriage for the librarian but doesn't get the girl. Doesn't get either of them. Instead he gets Yorick. Oh, that might be my words. I'm sorry. I don't think I'm quoting her anymore. Yeah, he sets up Victoria Lund with her future husband, and he doesn't get to be with Olga either, which is probably for the best. But instead, as a compensation, if you like, he gets his best friend, his staunch companion, and the most trustworthy character really in any of the books, in Jornik Byrnison. The last thing that I'll note, what I might have expected to find in this story, something about the ring, which becomes so important, the turquoise ring. There's a lantern slide about how Pullman wonders too, how did that ring come to be in John Perry's possession? What's the story behind that? And we don't get much here of Lee's childhood, his raised by his mother, and that was her ring, and this and that. The power of dreams and shamanism is not present in this version of the North. Witches, the Aurora, right? They only figure just at the edges of the story in the form of that flavor text on the Peril of the Pole board game. So I've taken an enormous amount of your time, and I think a lot of mine as well, trying to put together a persuasive account of this, a commentary that does justice to this story. I hope that this has been enjoyable for you, and I do hope that I get back to La Belle Sauvage and the Book of Dust soon. I'll have more about the companion books as we go along, and I'll have more conversations if I can find more people willing to have them. Thanks again for listening, and I do appreciate any comments and questions you might ask in the chat here. Until next time, take care.